Hey friends! Most of the time, music producers just slap reverbs on their mixes and simply move on without giving it much thought. Since we never hear sounds in real life without some form of reverb, to most folks, adding some reverb tends to make sounds better. But in reality, while reverberant sounds might be a little bit more familiar, excessive uncontrolled reverb can also wreck a mix, smearing rhythms, masking subtleties, and creating busyness. So in this video, we're going to explore how we can use Ableton's own reverbs in combination with other Ableton devices to create a more natural and palatable reverb that instead complements and enhances rather than smears and obscures your mix. Let's do it. Okay, so here's a really dry mix. Let's take a listen. Okay, so let's say I want to put a reverb on this lead, which is this drift track right here. Let's go ahead and solo it, and I'll go ahead and start introducing the reverb that's living on the A return. So let's go ahead and take a listen to that. So to my ears, I hear a lot of things that are getting lost here. And one of the things that I hear is that we're losing the groove of the lead. The lead is sometimes making bright signal and sometimes being dark, right? And that push and pull kind of makes a really interesting groove, right? So without it... What the reverb does is it makes the treble last so long that it's masking that groove, right? So one of the first things we can do is we can filter out some of that bright top end. So what I'm going to do is use the input filter here on Ableton's Reverb, and I'm going to filter out some of that bright top end. It's pretty rare in nature that you have very, very long reverb tails that are very bright, so this also creates somewhat of a natural sound. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is stereo. Now, we can hear that the lead is very wide. There's a lot of stereo information, right? Now, let me show you something else. If I go into the drift track and I turn off, I'm using the frequency shifter and the shifter device to make this really wide signal, right? Listen to how much more detail you hear in the reverb when I turn this wideness off. So first, let's listen to it with it on. So what this is illustrating is a really important axiom of mixing, and that's that if everything is wide in your mix, then nothing is wide. You see, what's happening here is that because both the reverb and the lead were wide, they were conflicting with each other and masking certain aspects about each other. What we're doing here is we're separating these two elements so that they have their own space to occupy. And so perhaps the lead sounds better when it's nice and wide if it doesn't have reverb on it. But in this case, I like the sound of the lead better, and I like the sound of the reverb better now that they are separated from each other. Also, another thing that's interesting is that, to my ears, I can still achieve this really cool atmospheric effect, probably by turning the reverb send down a little bit, because now it's got its own space to occupy. It's not fighting with the wideness of the lead to be in the mix. Let's go ahead and listen to this in the mix now. Now let's go ahead and turn on the wideness of this lead and listen again, and you'll hear that masking effect. Right? Now, in the interest of getting these two sounds away from each other, here's another thing that we can do. Looking at this reverb, Ableton defaults its pre-delay, or in other words, a delay on when the reverb fires, and it sets it at 2.5 milliseconds. That's very, very fast. So another way that you can separate these elements, separate the lead from the reverb, is to increase the pre-delay. Let's go ahead and take a listen to how it is now. You can hear that the reverb and the lead are sort of on top of each other. But if we increase the pre-delay, essentially what we're doing here is we're taking the walls of our fake room that we've designed with this reverb and we're pushing them away from the sound. And this can be maybe more of a natural sound when it comes to using these long reverb tails. Right now I've got almost a 3-second decay on this reverb, so this might sound a little bit more natural, okay? And also the benefit in the mix is that now the reverb is not stepping on the toes of the lead as much, okay? Another thing that this does is this tricks the ear into thinking that the lead is closer to us and the reverb is farther away from us. Now, another thing that we can do that's very powerful is to consider the frequency content of the lead versus the reverb. Right now, the reverb is essentially creating decay on the strongest or loudest frequencies coming out of the reverb. And so let's go ahead and grab an EQ. And let's grab it and drag it onto the drift track first, okay? So this is the lead, and let's take a listen to this, and let's identify the loudest frequencies of this drift. So this area right here are the fundamental frequencies, or the lowest frequencies that the drift is making, and usually the fundamental frequencies are the loudest frequencies. This also happens to be low mids, which, as you know, when it comes to mixing, low mids can build up in a mix. So if we really want to clean this up and really make this sound nice, what we can do is we can take this EQ and put it on the reverb, and instead remove those frequencies, okay? So I use the reverb to sort of identify those frequencies, and now I'm going to remove them. And let's take a listen to how much cleaner this will sound as I pull this out. Now let's go ahead and listen to this with the mix, and I'll A-B the EQ. Right? So I think when you're first starting out with mixing, I think that a lot of folks assume that you need to put reverb on the whole drum set in order for it to sound natural. Let's go ahead and do that. I've got a reverb here on this track. Let's go ahead and add some reverb to these drums. Now, this puts the drums in a space. We have a space now, but potentially this isn't necessarily what we're going for. Now, I think perhaps the snare drum would benefit from some reverb here because it would be nice to have some long tail on that snare drum. But in this case, you know, the hi-hat having reverb, there's a lot of brightness in the reverb. It just doesn't sound nice, right? So instead of doing it this way, a better way to do this is to have your drums broken out into separate tracks. And so that's what I've done down here. Here is the exact same drum mix. It just happens to be separated into different tracks. So I'll go ahead and mute this one. And so let's go ahead and listen to this, and I'll bring some reverb into the snare. Now again, long brightness and reverb is very rare to experience in real life, and it also sounds pretty unnatural. And so in this case, I want to show you a different approach. This is the input filter of the reverb. There's also a diffusion network. So essentially what the diffusion network is saying is how long are the highs lasting versus the lows. And so you can actually change how long those highs last. So one thing I could do is do this. That as opposed to having this all the way up. Notice now that the highs and the lows are decaying the same amount, right? Let's go ahead and just listen to the snare drum so we can hear this. Notice with this lower setting that now the highs aren't lasting as long as the lows, okay? And this is also the natural behavior of rooms and spaces, okay? But what I want to do is take this even a step further. Let's grab this EQ. Now, something that can be really, really fun to do is to accent certain frequencies inside of reverb. So this snare drum is making some interesting harmonic in it, right? And that might actually sound cool with my song. So let's go ahead and unsolo this because, again, we don't mix in isolation. It's much better to mix with all the elements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hunt around until I can find that frequency. So you can hear that kind of like hitting a tennis ball kind of sound here. That's pretty cool. We can make the cue even more narrow. And that sounds really good. But something that I want to do is I want this to decay as long as 1 second. So I'm going to actually undo what I did in my diffusion network and focus on using the EQ instead to change the frequency content of this reverb. So what I can do is I can use, you know, a high cut and really just focus this reverb in on just that one little frequency right there and maybe leave it a little bit wider on the bottom. Now that is a really interesting sound, right? But in this case, I kind of want this to be part of my snare drum. So another thing that I can do is I can reduce the stereo width. Right now, this is a very wide reverb, and because of that, it's going to be conflicting with other elements in my mix. So I'll go ahead and turn the stereo down. Right? Let's go ahead and add a little bit more brightness in there. And that might be a bit heavy-handed when it comes to the Q. Cool. And now I can go ahead and dial this in. Right now, that's a lot of reverb, so we're going to pull that back a bit. So let's go ahead and do something else. I'm going to go ahead and add another return track. And let's grab a hybrid reverb. Now, potentially you're still feeling like the drums are very dry. And yeah, something that we can do with hybrid reverb that's awesome is we can use convolution reverb to simulate real rooms. Because in the real world, rooms are not perfect, right? There's objects in them. There's all kinds of different things that are conflicting with the original sound, right? And so these different objects are going to bounce things off of them in different ways. Also, rooms are not always a perfect shoebox shape. Sometimes walls aren't parallel. And so what's nice about hybrid reverb is that if you take the blend and pull it all the way to the left, or you can just choose convolution, you can just use the convolution side of hybrid reverb to put your drums or some other sound in a space, okay? And so you'll notice that the convolution reverb has early reflections as the first folder. But there's a folder called Made for Drums, and this one's really nice because these are real spaces, convolution spaces that you can put your drums in. And so you definitely want to make sure your dry wet is all the way up if it's living on a return. And so the first thing that you can do to try these different rooms out is to turn your entire drum send up into these rooms. So let's do that first. So that's a nice ambience. Let's try a different one. So I really like the live studio room left-right. That's a really, really good one. But obviously, again, we're running into that same thing where the reverb is, it's just really taking over. I don't need as much, for example, on the kick drum. Maybe my toms would benefit from more of it. So again, having this as a send and then having them available for each one of my drums to dial in a different mix is really what we're going for. So let's go ahead and start with the kick. As you can hear, it really doesn't take that much. Just a little bit of that kick drum in there sounds pretty nice. Let's go ahead and work on the snare now. That sounds good. Let's go ahead and listen to the toms. Great, now let's go ahead and add the hats. Cool, so now I've got a nice blend into this reverb, but this reverb again is very bright, okay? There's no processing on this reverb right now other than some EQ. Now hybrid reverb, they thought of everything with it and they put an EQ inside of the actual device. So what we can do is we can use this EQ here to maybe make this sound a little bit better. So let's go ahead and solo the drums just so we can really hear the difference here, and let's go ahead and mess with this. So you can see that I'm being really subtractive here, and you might be thinking, okay, I can't really hear the reverb as much as I could before. So something that's really interesting that we can do, let's go ahead and I'm also going to turn off the reverb on the second send, that long tail on the snare, so we could really hear the difference here. Let's go ahead and listen to this with the reverb and then take the reverb out, because you actually might be surprised how much reverb there is still on these drums. So with it, without it. Let's go ahead and do that with the rest of the mix. With it. Without it. So adding the snare reverb back in. Now that both of these reverbs are dialed in, I can now mix the two snare reverbs into something that might sound a little bit better and more balanced. So let's go ahead and listen, and I'll pull this back until there's a nice blend. awesome. Now, maybe something else to understand is that there's a lot of processing on my master right now, or my main track. For example, I have a glue compressor and a limiter and stuff like that. Compression and limiting tend to bring up the lowest sounds in a mix. If I turn my compressor off, for example, take a listen to the reverb. Now let's turn the compressor back on. Hear how much more reverb there is? Now, this is a very, very reverb-heavy mix. I would never print a mix with this much reverb on it. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that if you do a bunch of processing on your main output afterwards, what's going to happen is that the reverbs are going to come up. So it may be a good idea once you start working on your main track or your master track to go back into your reverbs and dial them back until they sound good. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. I'll tab over to session view and pull my returns up a little bit so I can look at them, and I'll dial them into taste. So first of all, this is the lead. Let's work on the snare. Cool, so that sounds to me like a really nice blend of all these reverbs together. Awesome. If you've got more reverb strategies, please share them down in the comments. If Ableton's your thing, it's my thing too, so make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so that you're notified when I make more content. So much love, everybody. I'll see you next time.